Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on the rise of Black equality. We're going to be looking at radical Reconstruction. And what we're going to look at in this conversation is the Freedmen's Bureau, the government program that was created to assist freed slaves after the war in transition, obviously. The radical Republicans seizing control of Congress in 1865 and the important things that happened as a result of that, and then the radical Reconstruction program that was put in place between 1865 and 1870, which included the 14th Amendment, the Military Reconstruction Acts of 1867, the 15th Amendment, which is the Voting Rights Amendment, and then a series of accomplishments by Republicans, and then ultimately the readmission of all of the Confederate states by 1870. So the question I want to start this conversation with is, what adaptive challenges did freed slaves face? So you have a situation in which people are transitioning now, and we're talking millions of people, from slavery to freedom. And there's going to be adaptations that are necessary. What challenges did the freed slaves face in this transition? Uh, what did they have to adapt to? In what ways did they have to adapt? And in what ways did they need assistance? Did they need any assistance at all? That's a really important question to think through what type of adaptations we're going to be facing freed slaves in the years following the Civil War. Brenda Salter McNeil, in her book Becoming Brave, said, when individuals or groups are forced to live in two separate social worlds, their adaptive strategies and commitment to thrive declare their human dignity in the midst of a potentially dehumanizing situation. It affirms that we are created in the image of God and that nothing can take away our capacity to love, to experience joy, and to have the audacity to hope. Refusing to give up and choosing to live in spite of the challenging circumstances we may face is actually a brave act of resistance. And I chose this quote because I think McNeil really helps to frame this conversation. You have a situation in which people are facing enormous challenges. The entire system, the entire economic way of life, people's survival was literally just blown up by the Civil War. And now you have a situation where you have to adapt. You have to create new strategies. You have to make new commitments to thrive in the midst of an incredibly difficult situation, but in a situation which also has hope. There's also more hope at this time than in any time previous in American history for Black Americans, but there's also great difficulty. And it is in these moments when people declare their human dignity by adapting and committing themselves to thrive in the midst of horrible circumstances and strive towards that hope and have, as Barack Obama said, the audacity to hope in the middle of difficult circumstances. So I love how this quote frames the conversation and frames what we're going to be looking at in the coming minutes here. So one of the ways the government responded to this situation and others, and we're going to see that, is to provide relief. And one of the things that's really positive about this period is that thousands of Americans responded to this situation by providing relief and support, and many of those people were Christians. The Freedmen's Bureau was a government agency established in March of 1865 as the war was coming to a close, and it was given the job of providing provisions, clothing, fuel, and food and resources, and to manage the 40-acre plots of land that we had planned to give to freed slaves. Now, that ultimately is not going to come to fruition. President Johnson is going to get rid of that program. But initially, the idea was that we were going to take those confiscated lands from Southern Confederate leaders and we were going to divide them up for the freed slaves. We ultimately don't do that, but these other things the Freedmen's Bureau is going to do. It was put under the leadership of General Oliver Howard, and the Freedmen's Bureau agents, they helped freed slaves negotiate labor contracts. They provided medical care. They set up schools. They administered courts to help deal with disputes and other issues involving land titles. This agency did some really good work for a period of 7 years, but sadly was dismantled in 1872, long before the need for this agency came to an end. This picture is of food rations being distributed by the Freedmen's Bureau in Uniontown, Alabama. So another agency that spoke into this situation was the American Missionary Association. Now, this is a private agency. It's a religious organization. It was actually formed in 1846 as an anti-slavery organization created by congregational churches in New England. During the war, the American Missionary Association provided aid to freed slaves that were in, as we saw, destitute circumstances. So they actually changed their mission during the war to help freed slaves. And then, whenever the war came to an end, they come alongside of the Freedmen's Bureau, in particular in the area of education. It is the American Missionary Association that is going to take a large role in education alongside the Freedmen's Bureau. And then when the Freedmen's Bureau expires in 1872, they're going to ultimately take up that mantle themselves. The American Missionary Association had a magazine called The American Missionary that they published. They founded the Freedmen's Aid Society alongside of the Methodists in the 1860s, and that agency specifically recruited teachers and administered schools, and then together with the American Missionary Association, these agencies founded more than 500 schools and colleges for Black Americans. The colleges included Howard University in Washington, D.C., Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, but enormous accomplishment. Thousands upon thousands of teachers were recruited and came to the North and taught thousands of freed slaves how to read and write. And just an enormously important Christian agency. We've talked about complicit Christianity. We've talked about courageous Christianity. This is clearly one of the greatest examples of courageous Christianity in going to where injustice is and working and sacrificing to bring an end to those injustices and give people the tools to live in a free and equal society ultimately. So we're going to shift gears now and look at the political questions. So we have some very direct aid being offered to people in need through the Freedmen's Bureau and the American Missionary Association. But what about the political questions? And so I want to begin by asking the question, what political problems did secession create? So we have to frame the conversation. We have to realize that 11 states have left the Union, fought a war, the war's over. What's the political situation? Do we just leave these people in? What do we do? There's very specific political problems that were created by secession that were not ended simply by the end of Civil War. And so what were those problems? Matthew 5:44 says, "But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." So one of the questions is, how are we going to treat the South at the end of the Civil War? What are we going to do? Are we going to hold their actions against them? Are we going to be forgiving? Is it going to be easy to come back into the Union? Is it going to be difficult? Are they going to have a price to pay? And people throughout history have responded in many different ways to these types of situations. Jesus said in Matthew 5:44, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, pray for those that have despitefully used you and persecute you. So my question is, do we apply Matthew 5:44 here? And we say, okay, here's the program. We're going to make it easy for them to re-enter the Union. That is one way to look at this. The second way to look at this was put forward by Fleming Rutledge in her book, The Crucifixion. Rutledge says, the reaction of many who have thought deeply about horrendous evils underscores the sense that although many believe that forgiveness in and of itself is the essence of Christianity, this is not so. A policy of forgive and forget can produce lasting harm on the political level as well as the personal. Peace without justice is an illusory peace that sets the stage for vengeful behavior later on. And so Rutledge raises a really good point. If you just allow these people, these states to come back into the Union, if you just look the other way at what the Confederate states did, forgive and forget, that creates potentially the ultimate desire for revenge because justice hasn't been done. What is justice here? How do we apply the biblical principle of Matthew 5:44 and the biblical sense of justice? What is justice in this case? How do we do that? How do we apply that? That's what the political leaders of this period are going to be tasked with figuring out. And it's a very, very difficult problem to figure out. So what are the political problems created by secession? Well, the map that we've been looking at reminds us of the divisions in the country and the complications of where slavery was and was not. So you have these 11 states in gray, and they are no longer part of the Union as far as representation go. So we have to figure out how to restore representation to these states. We have to figure out whether Confederate leaders, can Robert E. Lee become a senator from Virginia? What's that? That's a serious question to deal with. And then as we do that, what are we going to require with regard to the status of freed slaves? Are we going to require states make them citizens? Are they going to be given civil rights? Are they going to be given political rights? Are they going to be able to vote and hold office? And what you have to realize is, in the context of this conversation, in the North, there was segregation. There were free blacks in the North before the Civil War, uh, and segregation and disfranchisement of political rights already existed there. So the question is, moving forward now that slavery is done, there are some really complicated political problems created by secession and slavery that are going to have to be addressed. So how did that happen? How were those problems addressed? Well, in 1865, this really important kind of uh, hinge type event occurred. Um, there were these people, these were these political leaders in the Republican Party, and most of the Republican Party was defined by what we call the radical Republicans. And these radical Republicans opposed the lenient plan of the presidents for Reconstruction that we've talked about, and they also opposed the black codes that were being put in place in the South. And so they felt like these two things were really pointing the country in the wrong direction. And the radical Republicans during the Civil War had control of Congress. But at the end of the war in 1865, there were special elections held, and the idea was, under the lenient plan for Reconstruction of the president's plan, there were these special elections held. And under the lenient plan of the presidents, all that was required to restore your representation was some minimal loyalty oaths and some pardons and that sort of thing, in acceptance of the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. And so in those special elections of 1865, in the South, Confederates former Confederate leaders were elected to represent their states. But what happened, which was really critical, was when those members showed up to take their seats in December of 1865, the radical Republicans said no. They said, we're not going to seat you. We're not going to let you take your seats. And that is going to set off a period of time and a series of events in which the radical Republicans will have firm control because they refuse to allow those Confederate leaders to take their seats, and they refuse to allow the South to regain its representation in Congress. So it is these radical Republicans firmly in charge of Congress in 1865 that are going to do the things that we're going to see that we call radical Reconstruction. So it's these radical Republicans that are going to make the decision. So I want to ask the question, what decisions were necessary to create a free and equal biracial society after slavery? What specific political decisions were necessary? What hard choices were necessary by Congress, by the president, by the government of the United States in order to push us forward in this path towards a free and equal biracial society after slavery? John Mercer Langston, in his speech, Equality Before the Law, which he gave at Oberlin College, he said this: "The laws of a nation are no more the indices of its public sentiment and its civilization than of its promise of progress toward the permanent establishment of freedom and equal rights. The histories of the empires of the past, no less than the nations of the present, bear testimony to the truthfulness of this statement. Because this is so, her laws, no less than her literature and science, constitute the glory of a nation and render her influence lasting." Now, what is Langston saying? He's saying that these laws that we're going to make, these decisions that we're going to make, it is part of the promise of progress towards the permanent establishment of freedom and equal rights. These are monumental decisions that are going to be made. These laws are much more than just sentences written on a page. These things are going to plot a path forward. It is the glory of a nation. These laws will be the glory of a nation. It will be the influence of our future. Or the other side of the coin, if not done right, they will point us towards disaster. So one of these monumental decisions that was made was the passage of the 14th Amendment. This was passed by Congress in June of 1866. Remember, passed by Congress, proposed in a Congress that had no representation from Southern states, completely dominated by radical Republicans. And so the 14th Amendment, it reflects that thinking. It reflects that position. And so the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified by the three-fourths of the states in 1868, says, number one, every citizen, every American born or naturalized in the United States is a citizen, both of the United States and the state that they live in. It says, number two, that citizens have the privileges and immunities of United States citizens, that all citizens have these privileges and immunities as United States citizens. So everything that it says that applies to a citizen of the United States applies to a citizen no matter which state they live in. That no state can deprive a person of their life, liberty, and property without due process of law. All people come under due process. And fourthly, all American citizens come under the equal protection under the laws. It's a very specific statement that's to the states within the United States. It says you can't take away the privileges and immunities of a United States citizen. You can't deprive a person of life, liberty, of property. You can't take away equal protection under the law. These freed slaves, it doesn't say the word freed slave, but if you're born or naturalized in the United States, that would include all the freed slaves. They are citizens. They have citizenship in the United States and in the state that they live in. And this is the core idea of the civil rights imagined by our government and by radical Republicans. Now, the response to that is really sobering. There were race riots in both New Orleans and Memphis in 1866, both before and after this amendment was passed. Why were there riots and what did they look like? We are talking about white Americans. In this case is a picture of Memphis, Tennessee, where they burned down a Freedmen's Bureau school for Black Americans. And basically, it's white Americans saying no. We resist the idea that Black Americans are going to come into this new status of having these rights listed in the 14th Amendment. And so the 14th Amendment, a really, really important cornerstone piece of radical Reconstruction. Now, there's another congressional election in 1866, the 40th Congress, and this picture I show you just to establish the idea. Again, the only southern state that's been readmitted by this time is Tennessee. It's under the control of a radical Republican government, and you can see that the radical Republicans are going to dominate this election again. With a significant part of the country still new territories that haven't been formed into states, and the South not having been readmitted yet into the United States, Republicans achieve a two-thirds majority in both houses of Congress in 1866, which will allow them to continue to carry on their Reconstruction program. And so the result of that power in 1867, that domination of Congress, Thaddeus Stevens, pictured here, is one of the leaders of the radical Republicans. As a result of that power, radical Republicans passed the Military Reconstruction Acts of 1867. Again, they had a veto-proof majority. And so in these acts, they divided the South into 5 military districts with a general in charge of each district. So you're talking about a formalization of a military occupation. These generals were given the job of protecting the rights of people and property and implementing political reconstruction. And political reconstruction ended up to be states were to hold conventions to write new constitution. Each state in the South to be brought back into the Union to regain their representation in Congress and their political representation. The state had to hold a convention, not their legislature, but they had to hold conventions, kind of bypass the local government, the state government, and those conventions had to write new constitutions. And both the convention and the new constitution had to provide universal male suffrage and ratify the 14th Amendment. So that becomes sort of the cornerstone. We have to recognize freedom, we have to recognize the right to vote, and we have to ratify the 14th Amendment. That's the basic military reconstruction program of the radical Republicans. Now, one of the things that some people were concerned about was that even though the Military Reconstruction Act said you have to guarantee the right to vote, universal male suffrage, some people said there needs to be a more formal statement. And so what the radical Republicans passed in Congress in 1869, again, still firmly in control of Congress, was a proposed amendment that said the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The language here is so important. Why would they say the same thing in 3 different ways? Race, color, or previous condition of servitude? Well, they anticipated the fallibility of human beings, the desire to oppress, the desire to maintain control. And they anticipated that Southerners might say, oh, you can't vote not because of your race, but because of the color of your skin. Or you can't vote not because of the color of your skin, but because of your race. Or you can't vote not because of either of those reasons, but because you used to be a slave. And so they were very specific in this amendment, trying to create an ironclad set of words that said, there's no way you can take away a person's right to vote in the South. Now, the amazing thing about this is we will see in future conversation that white Southerners found ways around even this language because ultimately the right to vote is going to be denied. But in this moment, The right to vote is put into the Constitution in proposed by Congress in 69, ratified by 3/4 of the states by 1870. But you have to remember that this ratification process, both for the 14th and 15th Amendments, 3/4 of states included southern states, but southern states with radical Republicans in control of their reconstructed governments. You have to understand that. The Democrats in the South have not regained control. Southerners have not regained control of their own states yet as these things are being put in place. So we want to take a second and just note the enormous Republican accomplishments under Reconstruction. Enormous amount of relief given to freed slaves as they were in the middle of this transition. There are legal rights, things like the ability to own property, carry on a business, enter into a profession, and just simply learn to read and write. This is a beautiful picture of where we see Black Americans flocking to school, children, teens, adults going to the schools of the Freedmen's Bureau to learn to read and write in vast numbers. Really a beautiful picture of this opportunity for hope and movement forward in your life. Political rights, the beginnings of equality before the law, the right to vote, the right to hold office. Black Americans participated in those state conventions. They served in state legislatures at this time, even gaining a majority in the South Carolina legislature, and even had the opportunity to become members of the United States Congress. This is a picture of some of the earliest members of the United States Congress. Hiram Revels, pictured on the far left as you view the picture, was a senator from Mississippi, first member of Congress. He was a free black he was born free and ultimately became a African Methodist Episcopal Church minister. And he was appointed to the Senate in Mississippi to fulfill a vacant term. Later became president of a historically black college, Alcorn State University. Revels' story is a very familiar one. Most of the black Americans who became political leaders were free initially and were not slaves, but an amazing element of this story is that there were a number of slaves that rose to become members of state legislature and ultimately the United States Congress. And I want to look at a picture of, or not a picture, but a list of who those congressmen were. Former slaves who served in the United States Congress. Blanche Bruce, who served as a senator from Mississippi. Robert Smalls, who became a representative from the state of South Carolina. Joseph Rainey, also a representative from South Carolina. John Lynch, a representative from Mississippi, and Josiah Walls, a representative from Florida. To think of that amazing story of people born as slaves to ultimately become members of the United States Congress. What an inspiring story this is, and I would encourage you to maybe do some research on these 5 men. Have incredible stories and histories that go along with this service in Congress. So ultimately, the goal of Reconstruction was to bring the Confederate States back into the Union. By 1870, they had all been brought back. So when we get to the election of 1870, we're going to see a different dynamic now, and we're going to see over time in the 1870s a transition now in the South from radical Republicans being in control to Democrats regaining control. And so the successes of radical republicanism are ultimately going to be short-lived because of this dynamic. And this map helps us to understand that, because if you look at, for example, Texas, Texas, there's two dates there. There's 1870 and 1873. So Texas is readmitted into the Union in 1870. You see several states are readmitted in 70. Several are readmitted in 68. Tennessee was readmitted earliest. It was readmitted in 1866. But in 1870, when Texas was readmitted, it had a Republican controlled government. But by 1873, those Republicans have been ousted from control. So you see Arkansas that they're ousted, Republicans are ousted in 74. In Louisiana, they're ousted in 77. The point is, by 1877, within a decade, all Republican control is lost in the South, which is going to mean a different reality for free Black citizens by that time. So as we look at radical Reconstruction, we see that it involved the 14th Amendment, military Reconstruction, the 15th Amendment, Republican reforms, and then ultimately readmission of the Confederate States. Very, very critical moment in our history and critical moment for Black Americans. So in this conversation, we have looked at the rise of Black equality, radical Reconstruction, and we have looked at the Freedmen's Bureau and the American Missionary Association and Freedmen Aid Society that came alongside the Freedmen's Bureau, and how many people, many good people, many good Christian people came south and tried to deal with the problems existing at that time, in particular providing education, providing relief, providing transition for freed slaves. And then we looked at the radical Republicans and how they seized control of Congress in 1865 and basically held that control until 1871 firmly. Still had a lot of influence, but until the 1870s, and how they were able to implement their Reconstruction program between 65 and 70, and that included the 14th Amendment, the citizenship and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment, granting basic civil rights, the Military Reconstruction Acts, which set the pattern in place of an occupation in order to create the new governments that could be readmitted, and then the 15th Amendment, which established voting rights, and then all these Republican accomplishments, significant Republican accomplishments that we talked about, and ultimately the readmission of Confederate states by 1870. But ultimately, we realize that in the 1870s, those Republican governments that had been established in the southern states are ultimately going to lose power. Some takeaways from this conversation. Radical Reconstruction was a program advanced by congressional Republicans that readmitted southern states on the condition that they guarantee blacks freedom, citizenship, and equal protection under the law, and the right to vote and hold office. Two, a Congress dominated by Republicans, which did not include Southern representatives, implemented this Reconstruction program. And thirdly, radical Reconstruction did not address land or property issues or provide long-term monitoring of the implementation of Black equality. I think that's something important to bring in here at the end. Those issues were not addressed. It's going to create problems going forward. Some questions to consider. Should Christians support social justice programs such as the Freedmen's Bureau? Why or why not? Should we support those sorts of things? Number two, what does the Bible say about banning Confederate leaders from holding office? What should have been the choices? Did we make the right choices regarding that issue? And then thirdly, was radical Reconstruction consistent with Christian principles? Think of the moral implications of a radical Reconstruction. Thanks for joining this conversation today. God bless you and have a great day.